Okay, welcome back. This is National Master Robert Ramirez, and it's time to talk about backward pawns, also known as left behind pawns. And I wanted to start with this position. This is actually from a game that I played many years ago. And you can see that even though I'm not even close to the master level that you saw in the other games, I was able to identify this pawn on d6 that I'm already putting pressure on it. It is well defended, but a lot like the isolated pawn that we talked about in the very first video, it requires the defense of the pieces because the other pawns cannot help him. So I quickly went ahead and did bishop f4, just putting more pressure on it. And then this forces them to do e5. And this is officially, you can see what I left behind, what a backward pawn is. Before, this pawn had another pawn right next to it. So at the right time, they could do d5 at some point. But after they do e5, this pawn is the one behind, it's the base of the pawn chain, and it is weak. To make things even worse, it is on a semi-open file. So this is in by definition what I left behind pawn is much like the isolated pawn, but this one actually has a friend next to it and a friendly pawn, but that pawn is advanced. So in turn, it makes it to be left behind. So what do we want to do when we see a left behind pawn? First of all, we want to put pressure on it. Ideally, if we have an open file, just like we did with the isolated pawn. But also there's something very important that I didn't mention in our first video. In front of every isolated pawn, in front of every left behind pawn, you're going to see a weak square. And I want to secure it. I want to occupy it with one of my pieces. Ideally, a knight is going to enjoy an outpost on d5. So in this game, quickly, just to show you, I went bishop g5, my bishop is attacked, and I'm looking for a way to eliminate the knight, which is defending that. So after a6, I took, just taking advantage of the fact that I'm hitting the bishop as well. They took with the bishop, and I was able to just collect that left behind pawn. That's how weak it is. So again, this is pretty basic. Now you're going to see it in the hand of a very strong player. So I'm going to take you guys to my next, the next game. At this point, based on the definition that I gave you earlier, if you look at each one of the pawns for the white pieces, which one do you think is a left behind pawn? Well, we got d4. Again, if you imagine this one gone, you're going to see that it looks a lot like an isolated, you're going to see that it looks a lot like an isolated pawn, but of course they have a pawn next to it. So the moment we identify this left behind pawn, we want to make sure that it doesn't advances, make sure that it stays there, it's a liability, and that's what they did with pawn e6. So at this point, after Nimzowitsch did pawn e6, not only are we preventing it, but we're going to make sure that we occupy the square in front of it. Guys, when we have this kind of control, and this is very important, we identified the pawn, we put a knight in front of it. Now I want to use that knight to attack. That's not sufficient. Many of my students, they tell me, you know what? In this game, I did what you told me. I went knight e7, knight d5, and now I just lost the game. So what did I do wrong? Well, what we do wrong sometimes is that we forget to capitalize on that knight. What is the knight controlling? All of these squares. The king is on the king side. Well, I need to create something, advance and attack that king. So, and at this point, after king d5, we got rook c1, hitting the queen. I'm going to go quickly through these moves, but it's pretty natural. We have to move the queen, rook c4, then king gets out of this semi-open file, queen d2, rook c8, being very careful. We don't want to get checkmated, and knight d3, rook d8, queen c2, f5, and then here, look at this pawn structure. The pawn structure now is indicating we should expand on the king side. That's what we have space. So after rook c1, look at this, a lot of pressure on our king. The king is defended, and it's partly because of that knight. That knight from d5 is going to help us be aggressive, but it's also going to be defending c7. And again, the knight is allowed to be there because this is a left behind pawn. There are no other pawns that could kick us out. So we got g5 again. Nimzowitsch understood this. He's not just standing there, look at my beautiful knight. He's actually doing something with the help of the knight. So knight c5, that square, well, we have the bishop to eliminate it. And now, like I told you, I think on video number 1, we are left. It's not what we trade, it's what we are left with. We're left with a very powerful knight that cannot be kicked out by a pawn. It cannot be kicked out by a light square bishop. So it's going to stay there for a long time. So rook g8, we are switching gears now to attack that king. Queen e2, pawn h5, bishop d2, and you guys should be familiar with this pawn storm. Just trying to open up lines towards the king. So a4, they're trying to do the same thing, and it's all about who gets to the other king first, who makes contact first. g4, a6, and after b4, c6, you see, we're not letting them look. If you think about it, this is another very similar to this pawn, right? And right now they cannot even do b5. So we got rook b1. They really want to make this work. But then after queen f7, rook b3, f4, we are ready to finally make contact. So queen e4, and then f3. We make contact. Now, if they take us, well, we're opening up lines. If they don't, we're going to be taking ourselves. We're going to be opening up even more lines with moves like g3. Now, don't forget, this is a little bit irrelevant, but don't forget that if we could, we would just make these pawns disappear. We just need lines to attack that king. Of course, it's handy that we're going to be challenging these pawns so that they get out of the way as well. So we take on g2, king takes, and then we bring all of our pieces to the king side, ready to attack. So rook f1, very passive. It's always very nice to see our opponent's pieces being passive. So finally we got g3. Look at this battery. We put in pressure on the rook, and now the f pawn cannot take us. So g3 happened, h takes, and now, of course, they're not going to do rook takes. If rook takes pawn, we collect the rook. Again, they cannot take with the f pawn. They have to take with the rook. So let me actually show you. There we go. And then we could just continue to attack the king. This is already winning for the black pieces. But of course, in this game, they did pawn to f4. And then that knight, look, is going to leave d5 to get in front of another what? This is another left behind pawn. So we got knight e7, then knight f5 just in time. From light square to light square, nothing that this bishop could do to it. So rook h1, rook g4, trying to put even more pressure. And after bishop g3, then all of our pieces are going to be continuing to put pressure on that g file. Again, guys, I'm going really quickly over these moves because the main thing that I wanted you to get is how this knight is identifying that square in front of the left behind pawn. It's not so much about getting the left behind pawn, even though you could, but ultimately we want to capitalize on that square in front of it. So queen g6, I think we're even setting up a quick tactic here, discover attack. So the queen needs to leave, then we take on g3, and after rook f4, this is just overwhelming. So just to show you a few more moves, we have rook d4, queen f2, trade, check, and again, at this point, this is just winning for the black pieces. They take another pawn, this is a pass pawn, check, and at this point, the white pieces resigned. Now, it might seem like there's a lot to be done here, but in reality, it should be an easy way to win. From here, if they do something, I'm threatening to do rook d2, so they need to do something about that. If they did queen f3, well, this check is going to be really annoying. If they do something like king h3, well, queen h1, very annoying. But ultimately, if you just collect this other pawn, this is just going to be very easy to win. So like I told you in game number 1, I'll really advise you to take this position, set it up against the engine here in chess.com and see if you can finish it, see if you can take it all the way to checkmate. Now, like I always like to do, I'm going to take you all the way back to the initial position that I showed you. So after the white piece is castled, we identify the left behind pawn. We're going to make sure that they cannot advance it. And of course, we are opening up for the knight to come over. Then, if we could put pressure on it, collect it, great. But at the very least, we want to put our knight in front of that pawn. And that's going to be a very powerful piece. From there, try to pay attention to the squares the knight is controlling. We want to expand on that side of the board. So with that said, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you found this video useful, and I will see you in our next video.